Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to STL History Live Statehood Day virtual program. My name is Aaron Pelker. I am a community engagement coordinator with the Missouri History Museum's Public History Department, and I want to thank you for spending Statehood Day and part of your Tuesday morning with us, whether that's virtually through Zoom or if you're here in person at the History Museum. We're happy to see you this morning. Before we get to our presentation, I do have a couple of brief remarks. First, I want to mention that both the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park and the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum in downtown St. Louis are both open to the public. The museum is now open on Tuesdays, but our Soldiers Memorial is open from Wednesday through Sunday. So the museum is open Tuesday through Sunday and Soldiers Memorial Wednesday through Sunday. Your safety is a top priority, and we would love for you to visit if you feel comfortable doing so. You can visit both locations, but please visit mohistory.org to plan your visit. I also do want to mention that our Library and Research Center is now reopened for in-person appointments by reservation on Thursdays and Fridays. And again, I do encourage you to check our website, mohistory.org for further details. Also, I would like to thank our museum members and the Zoom Museum Tax District for their generous support for both our exhibits and our programming. We wouldn't be able to host programs like this morning without their contributions. Also, today's program is presented in conjunction with a statewide effort to honor Missouri's bicentennial this year. Today, August 10th, is actually Missouri's 200th birthday. So in a bit, I'll drop a link to the statewide event calendar for programs related to Missouri's bicentennial and history, and that will take place throughout the remainder of this year and into 2022. Lastly, before I turn it over to our presenter for this morning's program, I do want to explain a few of the features you'll find on Zoom that may be helpful this morning. First, this will be about a 45-minute presentation with some time at the end for our presenter to answer a few questions. For those of you on Zoom, you can submit your questions for our speaker at any time through the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. This morning, we're also happy to have accessibility features. If you're with us in person in our grand hall, you'll see the live transcript scrolling across the screen. If you're joining us through Zoom, we also have 2 ASL American Sign Language interpreters with us this morning. So thank you for that. And finally, at the conclusion of the program, we hope you'll complete a short survey that should open automatically in your internet browser. We appreciate and look forward to your feedback. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Peter Castor. He's a professor of history and American culture studies at Washington University in St. Louis. So thanks and enjoy the presentation, and take it away, Peter.
Thank you so much. One thing I will simply add before I begin, I hope that all of you can hear me. Aaron, I know you just muted your screen, but since you're the person I can see, are you able to hear me? Oh, Aaron has muted himself. Oh, we're good to go. So that's one of the requirements in all of these Zoom presentations. We need to make sure everyone can hear everyone. It's great to be here. I'm sorry we can't all be together in person, but perhaps in my wish to be together in person, I've chosen a background that's appropriate to this. It's the Grand Hall of the Missouri History Museum. So even if I can't join you in person, I can pretend that I'm there. So let me begin by saying that I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm delighted that you're all here as we commemorate the bicentennial of Missouri statehood. And I hope that today we can, I'll be sharing some thoughts with you, but I hope we can have a discussion about how Missouri became a state and what it meant to become a state. But here's the problem I often think about when we discuss this subject. When we hear about Missouri statehood, we tend to look forward. What happened after Missouri became a state? How did we go from something that wasn't a state to the state that we are now? Well, I want to do things a little differently. I want to look backward. I want to be historical. After all, I'm a historian. I want to consider what this space was before it became a state, how people lived during that time, and how things changed and didn't change after Missouri became a state. And that really leads me to my main point, which are a series of questions. What did it mean for Missouri to become a state? What did Missouri gain from this? What did it lose? And I want to bear in mind that there's plenty of both gains and losses to go around. And these are questions that I was thinking about as I organized this talk, but they're questions I want you to consider. And there are a few other questions I want to toss out to you because I'm looking forward to your questions when I'm done with my formal remarks. But there's some questions I want to ask you that I hope can fuel a conversation that follows. For those of you who've been out of school for a while, when you think back to when you were in school, what did you learn about Missouri statehood? And what did you learn about the history of Missouri before it became a state? And I think a conversation about that can help us understand the way people learn about the past and how they choose to remember the past. More specifically, what did you learn about how government operated before statehood and how people lived before Missouri became a state? Those are some questions I want you to consider. I'll provide some details here, but I'll come back to those questions during the Q&A, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments on that. So as I said, some key points to bear in mind is that statehood is a story of both gain and of loss. And to understand those gains and losses, we really need to understand how life operated before statehood. We also need to understand how statehood did and did not transform this place and this region. So to understand that, I'm going to use the founding of St. Louis and the creation of Missouri really as my bookend. So I really want to focus on this period from 1764, the founding of St. Louis, through 1821, the establishment of the state of Missouri. And I'm going to tell you a history of this region, and I particularly want to focus on the period of federal rule, the years that immediately preceded statehood. Now, as I discuss this, unfortunately, we're not meeting in person, so you can't raise your hands. But I encourage you to post any questions that you've got. Aaron will be gathering those, and I will do my best to answer all of them at the conclusion of my comments. So anyway, that's my chronology. Now let me tell you a bit about my cast of characters. First and foremost, it's Missourians, men and women, and they consist of a number of groups. Native American Missourians, African American Missourians, who I'll sometimes refer to as Black Missourians, and Euro-American Missourians, who I'll often refer to as white Missourians. And finally, there's the place itself, because Missouri is actually an actor in this. It's a geographic space, it's a political entity, and it has its own history. And when we look at all four sets of characters, Native Missourians, African American Missourians, Euro-American Missourians, and Missouri itself, here's what we learn. The big winner out of statehood is Missouri itself, by which I mean a geographic space that gained new political powers and a new trajectory through statehood, which was very different from how it had operated before. But statehood itself also brought tremendous opportunities for white Missourians. Meanwhile, the terms of Missouri statehood meant that the vast majority of Black Missourians would remain enslaved, and those who were free would face new challenges. Now, statehood would have limited impact on Native Missourians, but statehood as a transition could only come about because there had been profound changes for Native Missourians during the years before statehood. So with that said, let me begin my story. As I've said, the location is the space that eventually became Missouri, and my starting point is 1764, the founding of St. Louis. So let me give you a sense of how to understand this space. First of all, there was no place called Missouri. There was no bounded geographic area where if you asked people in 1764, they would say, yeah, that's Missouri. But they would talk about a region that extended west of the Mississippi River, roughly in the midpoint of the river. And to understand this space, you need to begin by understanding that it's a space that was claimed by European empires, but was governed day to day. It was principally governed by Native Americans. Numerous villages, various political alliances, elaborate diplomatic relationships. But the most powerful villages were the Osage villages, in an area that's really now central Missouri. So they were not only the largest population groups, but they were also the most important political groups. Now, as I said, it's also a space that was claimed by different Europeans at different times. And the European empire that laid claim to this region in 1760 were the French Empire. They claimed it as part of a vast colony called Louisiana. But there were very few people from France or from the French colonies who had moved here. There was a small group that had begun arriving in this region since the late 17th century. The first enslaved Africans arrived in what is now Missouri in the 1720s. They were brought here principally to work in the lead mines of what are now southeastern Missouri. But in 1763, France had ceded its entire Louisiana colony, including the area that became Missouri, to Spain. The interesting thing is that what this meant was that in 1764, Louisiana belonged to Spain, but there were no Spanish officials who had arrived to take charge. And it's in 1764 that a series of French-speaking people sought to found a town in the mid-Mississippi Valley. 1764 was the year that a group of ambitious Europeans hoped to build a trading outpost on the banks of the Mississippi River. Now, the leader of this initiative, Pierre Leclerc, was from France proper, but his stepson, Auguste Chouteau, was born in New Orleans, and they're great examples of how this region's first European and Euro-American settlers were from a larger French empire. They're not just from France itself. Chouteau had not been born in France, but he'd been born in a French empire, spoke French, and saw himself as part of a larger French system. But to build this outpost, Leclerc and Chouteau had to secure permission from native Missourians, in no small part because the reason they wanted this outpost was so they could trade with those native Missourians. That was the reason to start a town here. And this is the dynamic that really prevailed in this region for the remaining decades of the 18th century. Native Missourians governing much of this space, especially the area west of where we are now. White Missourians living primarily along a narrow band immediately west of the Mississippi River, governed first by the French and then by the Spanish. They were joined by a growing number of Black Missourians, most but not all of them enslaved. Many of them were enslaved, but there's also a population that at the time was referred to as free people of color, who occupied a highly specific yet nebulous legal status in the French and Spanish empires. The interesting thing to me when I look at and study this period is that even though the Spanish were technically in charge, the Spanish weren't actually able to get large numbers of Spaniards to move here. They wanted to populate this region. There's still this French-speaking population, but there are not many people from Spain moving here. They actually tried to recruit people from east of the Mississippi River, principally from Kentucky. One of those people was Daniel Boone, who many of you have probably heard of. He was part of an Anglo-American settlement that moved here principally in the 1780s and 90s. Boone was kind of at a loose end in Kentucky, and so he arrives in Missouri. He's given a kind of low-level government official appointment by the Spanish, and he joins a large number of local officials who are serving the Spanish, but who might have been born in what's now the United States. They might have been born in France. They're part of a larger Atlantic world through which people of various ethnic backgrounds are coming to the North American interior. As I said, this is the state of affairs in the late 18th century. And then things begin to change. They begin to change with a secret agreement in 1800. It's an agreement between France and Spain. It's often referred to at the time as the retrocession. It's an agreement through which Spain returned Louisiana to France. And they did so for reasons that are really tied up in Atlantic diplomacy, imperial concerns. From the American perspective, the details are less important than the threats that American policymakers perceived. Thomas Jefferson had just been elected president, and he was deeply worried about this. And he had to figure out how to try to solve this problem. He worried that with France once again controlling Louisiana might reflect French ambitions in the Americas. France and England had a tense relation. They had just signed a peace treaty after years of war. He worried that if war erupted, Britain might come into French Louisiana and then come into the United States. He worried this might invalidate agreements between the United States and Spain. The fundamental challenge facing the Jefferson administration was what to do. And I hate saying this to any Missouri audience, but Missouri actually wasn't part of Jefferson's considerations. His principal concern was to consolidate US control east of the Mississippi River. So the US would be secure and would not face risks coming from west of the Mississippi. He also believed that the United States was not yet ready to expand west of the Mississippi River, that to do so might generate internal tensions, internal conflicts that would rip the Union apart. So Thomas Jefferson focused on acquiring New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, again, east of the Mississippi River. The US did not seek and did not expect to receive anything west of the Mississippi River. These are the circumstances that are in place when the French impose a treaty on the United States. Many in Missouri know that Missouri was acquired by the United States through an agreement called the Louisiana Purchase. That implies that the US went out and bought this territory. And it's true, the US bought it, but I often think a better way to understand it is that the French sold it, and they dictated the terms on which they would sell it. They said they concluded that they would sell all of their colony of Louisiana, which meant all of this land west of the Mississippi River. And it isn't just that they determined what they would sell, they determined the price, which was beyond what the US could spend and required a very elaborate funding system, which I'm happy to talk about if you have questions about it. But what really interests me is what this treaty said about the residents of Louisiana, because of course that's who we should be concerned about. What would the Louisiana Purchase mean for the people who lived here? What would it mean for the place that became Missouri? Well, there was vague language in the treaty that said that the residents of Missouri would be incorporated into the United States as quickly as possible, that they would be treated equally within the United States. And this raised a fundamental problem for federal leaders and a fundamental question for people living in Missouri. So let's think about it from the Missouri perspective. If you lived in Missouri, the place that became Missouri, in 1803, and then at the end of the year, you learn that this land, which had been French and then was claimed by the Spanish, but was governed by Native Americans, was now going to become part of the United States. What was that going to mean? And what would it mean for these different groups of Missourians? What would it mean for white Missourians, for Black Missourians, for Native Missourians? And all of them were wondering about this in 1803 and 1804. Now let's look at this from the federal perspective, from the US perspective. What are they going to do? I mean, this is really a classic question. And it's one I've often taught to my students, that if you were serving in the administration of Thomas Jefferson in 1803 and you faced this challenge, what would you do? If you had received a treaty, you were required to take over land that you had not expected and had not sought, and there's a large population there that you have to govern. The first consideration of the US was, well, maybe they could modify the treaty. Well, the French were unwilling to do that. And from the federal perspective, there were threats that came with this. The first was one of foreign interference, that if the US acquired this land, foreign empires might try to interfere. The federal government knew that there were numerous and powerful Native American polities in Louisiana, and they worried that those people might resist federal rule. They worried as well about the large Black population. This was at a time, remember, that most of the leaders in the federal government were slaveholders. They were committed to preserving enslavement in the United States, but there had also been a Black rebellion on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became the independent country of Haiti in 1804. And there was a real fear about a slave revolt or a revolt by free people of color. There were also concerns about the white residents of Missouri. Many federal leaders believed that they didn't understand American politics, they'd be unable to participate in it, and that this whole Western region, including Missouri, would remain somehow disconnected from the United States, that would be the site of resistance, and that that resistance could tear the Union apart. So what do you do? What do you do if you're a Missourian trying to imagine your own future as part of the United States? What do you do if you're a federal leader trying to imagine how to preserve the Union as it expanded west of the Mississippi River? Well, folks in Missouri had several ways of responding, and I'll get to them in a moment. But let's start by talking about what the federal government did, because much of what Missourians would need to do was in response to federal decisions. After considering various options, at the end of the day, federal leaders decided that they were going to adapt the territorial system of government for the land west of the Mississippi River. Now, territorial government isn't something that many Americans know about now, but it is absolutely fundamental to understanding our national history. The vast majority of states in the Union did so by first undergoing federal territorial rule. And it's almost as long as the history of the US itself. So let me explain a bit about how it worked. Territorial rule was supposed to resolve an age-old problem of empires. When the US declared its independence, many of its leaders concluded that colonial rule did not work because empires that had colonies were fundamentally unequal structures. Those colonies would always be subordinate. Their residents would never enjoy equality. And the lesson of the American Revolution seemed to be that empires couldn't work. You could not have an empire that also had equal government. So what do you do in place of that? Well, the United States faced this problem itself because in the 1780s, a number of states turned over to the national government land that they held in what is now the Midwest: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan. And the national leaders and then federal leaders had to decide what to do with that land. They said, we can't make it colonies. Instead, they developed what's called the territorial system. And it operates on a series of stages. That first you have land that would be governed by the federal government, that it would be organized. The federal government would create a local government to manage things there for a while. Crucially, the residents of those places would learn how to govern themselves. They would receive a representative government. And at some point or another, usually depending on population, they would be able to apply for statehood. And crucially, they would then enter the Union on equal terms. This is the plan. And the notion that Missouri would be equal to, I don't know, New York or New Hampshire or Idaho or California, that seems so commonplace to us now. But that concept was absolutely revolutionary in the late 1700s. The only model that American leaders could look at were, again, these empires of Europe, where you had an imperial center that had the majority of political power and a colonial periphery that did not. The crucial term to Americans was this notion of equality, not equality for all citizens, or rather for all people living within the country, but equality for the different pieces of the country, equality for each state. The territorial system was initially developed, as I said, for what was called the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, but it was actually first applied in Kentucky and Tennessee. And there's some general principles that applied to it. There were certain differences. Kentucky and Tennessee entered as slave states. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the Northwest Territory, legally were required to enter without slavery. Those were the fundamental differences, but nonetheless, those similarities were in place. There was also, though, the assumption that these would be places where, even if slavery was not legal, these would be places that would be principally populated and governed by white settlers moving from other states of the Union who knew how to participate in a Republican political system. And I should explain, when I use the word Republican, I don't mean our contemporary Republican Party. I mean Republicanism as an ideology, which was the term that people tended to use in the United States at that time. So this is the system that the United States had used throughout the Trans-Appalachian West. And there were real questions about whether it could work west of the Mississippi River. Some federal leaders believed that the French and Spanish imperial systems had made it impossible for white Missourians and people living in what is now Louisiana to govern themselves, that they would be unable to do this. But there really isn't another option. So the federal government decides that they're going to reorganize this area along the territorial system. They create two areas. One is a territory that corresponds to what is now roughly the state of Louisiana. And then there was everything else. Everything from the Louisiana-Arkansas border up to Canada, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It's not subdivided. The place that became Missouri was part of that, and the territorial capital was established in St. Louis, but there was no place called Missouri. So this is the territorial system. But how did people in what is now Missouri respond to this? Well, they responded in various ways. White Missourians tried to weigh the benefits and limitations. And what's really important was American officials believed that they would be resentful, that they couldn't remain in the French or Spanish Empire. Well, there's relatively little evidence that that was the case. The mostly French-speaking residents had relatively little attachment to the Spanish Empire, even though the Spanish had governed for a generation. Meanwhile, there were many of them whose family had fled France. Their families had left revolutionary France specifically because they worried about the government there. But most importantly, they saw real benefits to membership in the United States because they had seen that the US government, which was so worried about the possibility of disloyalty or resentment among Western settlers, would bend itself over backwards to support them. So they said there might be possibilities of membership in the United States as long as federal leaders would agree to certain key concerns that they had. White residents of Missouri believed it was vitally important that the federal government preserved old land titles. They believed it was fundamentally important that the federal government preserve African-American enslavement. So white Missourians go into this seeing this as a time of possibility. Native Missourians saw this as a moment of tremendous risk because they knew what had happened in the United States. They knew that the federal government had taken an aggressive, often military policy towards Native Americans east of the Mississippi River. And they worried that this era in which Native Americans had been able to negotiate on their own terms with the French might be coming to an end. So they believed they needed to negotiate with the United States, but they saw it as a moment of great risk. Black Louisianans reacted in a variety of ways, principally based on whether they were enslaved or whether they were free. So in the area that is now Missouri, and especially in the area that became Louisiana, there were large and prosperous communities of free people of color. Over the course of the 18th century, they had exploited legal principles of French and Spanish law to create opportunities for themselves. They had also formed highly effective communities, not only that would connect them to each other, but in some cases would connect them through long-standing connections to white Louisianans and white Missourians. What I want to emphasize is they did not have legal equality with whites, but they had generally been able to create greater prosperity for themselves than in other states of the US. And their goals were, again, to see this as perhaps a moment of opportunity to preserve their opportunities in Missouri. But to enslaved Missourians, they wondered what this moment would mean for them. The laws of race in colonial Missouri and colonial Louisiana had created greater opportunities for enslaved African Americans to secure their freedom. They could sue for their freedom against the will of their masters. And I want to emphasize that this system is not based, it's not as if white Missourians and white Louisianans were somehow kinder to enslaved African Americans. It is simply that legal principles that had emerged over time had created opportunities that enslaved Missourians and enslaved Louisianans had been able to pursue to their benefit. And what they wondered is what was going to happen in the United States. Now, in the years immediately following the Louisiana Purchase, the years before Missouri statehood, Black Missourians, enslaved Missourians especially, take advantage of every legal opportunity to continue to pursue their freedom. And they did so more actively and aggressively than in many other states of the Union. And they do this at the same time that the federal government is actually enacting changes designed to make those opportunities more limited. So let me talk a bit about what the federal government does. Creates this territorial system, appoints a series of territorial officials, but also over the years following the Louisiana Purchase begins to eventually subdivide this vast area of land north of what is now the state of Louisiana. And during the 18 teens, they carve out what is roughly a square that is west of the Mississippi River, with St. Louis as its capital, and this corresponds roughly to what will become the state of Missouri. That's a geographic change. But the first major political changes are to begin a process of creating new forms of participatory government. That means creating elected officials. Now, the governor of the territory of Missouri, that's always an appointed official. But they create new forms of participation, eventually creating an elected territorial legislature and also creating a non-voting delegate to Congress, which is really important to many in Missouri. They want, if they're not going to be able to vote in Congress, they want their voice to be heard in Congress. Now, the governors who have to oversee this are some familiar names. The second governor of what was originally called the Louisiana Territory and later the Missouri Territory was Meriwether Lewis. He took over almost immediately after returning from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he served as governor for about 2 years. The longest serving governor was William Clark, who served as governor here from 1813 until statehood for Missouri. And these governors helped to oversee some legal changes. First, there's an overarching legal change that goes into effect. The law in Missouri had been an amalgam of French and Spanish and Roman legal practices. And over the course of the early 19th century, during this territorial period, the federal leaders, mostly Anglo-Americans, tried to bring Missouri law into alignment with Anglo-American common law, the law that's practiced east of the Mississippi River. Now, many of the French-speaking population here were really worried about this. Some of them lose out as a result because it's a legal system they don't know and one that's difficult for them to navigate. And because there are actually so few lawyers in what's now Missouri in 1803, they can't really oppose these changes. It's very different in Louisiana, where there are a large number of attorneys and also wealthy and powerful planters who want to preserve the old legal system. And that's why Louisiana has a distinctive legal system to this day, whereas Missouri has a legal system that's much more in alignment with the rest of the United States. Another area of change is to modify the laws of race, principally to do so in a way that imposes new restrictions on free people of color and one that also limits the possibilities for enslaved Black Missourians to secure their freedom. Now, enslaved Missourians continue to resist this in a variety of ways. They'll continue to use courts of law to secure their freedom, and they'll continue to try to find ways that the law itself creates possibilities for them. So these are changes that are underway for white Missourians, for Black Missourians, and while all of this is happening, Native Missourians face unprecedented pressures, unprecedented challenges. As I said, they want to negotiate with the United States because they realize that in 1803, 1804, 1805, they're actually in a position of strength. But over the course of the next decade, that strength begins to crumble. And it starts because the United States begins to score a series of victories over Native Americans east of the Mississippi River. And these conflicts really reach an apex in the 18 teens. They coincide with the War of 1812. And by 1815, the United States really has newfound power in the Trans-Appalachian West. And American officials in Missouri seek to negotiate new treaties with Native Americans that are designed to extinguish Native sovereignty west of the Mississippi River, to bring them into a dependent relationship with the United States. All of these changes for Missourians are in place by the 18 teens, and they coincide with a sudden influx of settlers. White newcomers who are coming from east of the Mississippi River, many of them also bringing by force enslaved Black newcomers who are coming from east of the Mississippi. The white settlers hope to build plantations in Missouri, and enslaved Black people will be working on those plantations. Along the way, this new set of migrants quickly outnumber the French-speaking population, both white and Black. So there's both a racial change in Missouri and an ethnic change in Missouri. And as the population grows, this new government in Missouri, this elected territorial government, feels ready to petition for statehood. And so in 1818, the Missouri Territory applies for statehood. And this is a really big moment. It came after a number of other Western territories had become states. Since 1812, the US had actually created 5 new states: Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Illinois, and these sailed through without difficulty. In every case, it worked by the same process. The territorial legislator legislature requests said that they had over a certain population. They requested permission to write a constitution. After Congress granted that permission, they would send the Constitution back to Congress. Congress would not only approve the Constitution for the state, but make a formal approval of statehood. And many Americans said this proved the territorial system could work. Now, I said at the time of all this, William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he was the territorial governor, and he oversaw all of this, and he assumed that statehood would sail through without difficulty. And then things began to change. Missouri petitioned to write a state constitution. And when that came before Congress, a representative from New York named James Talmadge demanded that provisions be included in the Constitution that would provide for the gradual emancipation of enslaved African Americans in Louisiana and would eventually eliminate all enslavement in Missouri. Now, this really came as a surprise, especially to people in Missouri. Slavery had not emerged as a driving political issue in Congress. Many of the territories that had large numbers of slaves when they petitioned for statehood were permitted to keep slavery moving forward. And what followed was a loud, divisive, raucous argument in Congress about how to resolve this issue. It's usually referred to as the Missouri Crisis. And the reason I asked you at the start of this talk, what you had learned about Missouri statehood in school was whether you had heard about this thing called the Missouri Crisis. Well, the Missouri Crisis was the debate over whether Missouri would enter as a free state or as a slave state. And it took 2 years for Congress to sort this out. Now, at the end of the day, Congress agreed to let Missouri enter as a slave state. And the way this is usually taught is that this was achieved through something called the Missouri Compromise, and that there was this grand compromise through which Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state, and that this would establish a balancing act in the future. Well, one of the things that historians are finding is that while Missouri and Maine did enter at the same time, it isn't this grand balance. Rather, what happens is that people who want to see Missouri enter as a state and as a slave state, they know that people living in northeastern Massachusetts, they want to enter as a state. They want to enter as a state of Maine. And they basically hold Maine hostage. And they say, we're not going to let Maine enter as a state unless you let Missouri enter as a slave state. And that becomes a big part of this Missouri Compromise. The result of this is 3 years after Missouri makes its initial request in 1818, 2 years after this issue explodes in Congress, it is finally the case that on August 10th, 1821, Congress authorizes Missouri statehood. Here's the weird thing. During all of this process, in which it's so unpredictable, Missourians thought they had permission to form a state. So in fact, before statehood is formally announced, Missourians begin holding elections for a state of Missouri. One of the interesting things in this is that William Clark, who I mentioned before, the leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the man who had served as governor of Missouri, of the Missouri Territory for 7 years, he runs for governor of the state of Missouri. And it's not just that he doesn't win, he comes in something like 3rd or 4th in this. And it's really quite surprising. And the question is why? And I think it's very telling about what it was like to live in the territory of Missouri and what it's going to mean to live in the state of Missouri. Throughout his entire adult life, William Clark had served in the federal government, but he'd never once held an elected office. He'd always been an appointed official. He didn't know how to run for office, and he ran a really bad campaign in 1820. Alexander McNair, who won election as the first elected governor of Missouri, he knew how to run for political office. And men like him would assume leadership in the years ahead. You needed to know not just how to secure support from above, from the federal leadership in Washington, but how to secure support from below. And I want to use that to suggest how things would change in the state of Missouri, how we can use this moment of the bicentennial of statehood to see what changed and what did not. Now, I said there are gains and losses. The big winner out of Missouri statehood is Missouri itself. And that may seem like a weird thing. Let me explain that. Statehood would transform this space from a territory to a state. Territory and state, they just seem like words. What's that going to mean in real terms? Well, remember, before 1821, Missouri has a non-voting delegate to Congress. In many ways, its status is like that of the District of Columbia, the role that District of Columbia has now. After Missouri statehood, Missouri has 2 senators and an elected member of the House of Representatives who can vote in Congress. The 2 senators and the representative, they can all vote. And what this means is they suddenly have leverage. They can place demands on Congress. Missouri is a state like any other. What does that mean in real terms? Well, I want to explain it in terms of post offices. And that may seem like a surprise to you. Why are post offices going to matter? Well, actually, postal delivery was really important in the 1800s. This is before telephones, it's long before television. Mail delivery was the principal way that Americans felt connected to friends, to relatives, to the nation as a whole. And postal delivery was really expensive. And I actually spent some time looking at the growing number of post offices, and the number of post offices in Missouri exploded after statehood. It's not just because the number of people in the state increased, but it's also because that Missouri delegation to Congress, they could pressure Congress to provide funding. You get the member of the House of Representatives saying, I won't vote for your bill unless you provide appropriations to increase postal delivery to Missouri. So these are the very real changes that come with statehood. Now, what's this going to mean for the residents of Missouri? Well, for white Missourians, especially for politically ambitious white men, statehood creates a host of new political opportunities. And statehood also fueled increased settlement. That happens in every part of the North American West. The move from territory to statehood often precipitates a large-scale migration into the state. The population of Missouri would grow significantly in the decades that followed, and one of the principal beneficiaries of that would, of course, be St. Louis, which would go from being this small frontier outpost to really being the nexus for Western settlement. What would statehood mean for Black Missourians? Well, for many of them who are enslaved, it slams the door on freedom. The Missouri crisis had created the possibility that Missouri would enter as a free state. But by entering as a slave state, the vast majority of Black Missourians will remain enslaved. And what they will do is continue doing what they had done in the past, use the existing legal structure to try to secure their freedom. Now, I said at the start of my talk that for Native Missourians, statehood itself did not bring about a large change, but rather it came about as the end result of a series of changes. One of the expectations for a territory to become a state was that white supremacy was in place and working. And that was one of the goals of territorial government. William Clark, Meriwether Lewis, as territorial governors, they not only negotiated treaties with Native Americans, but they sought to extinguish Native sovereignty. And it was William Clark, who was not only a territorial governor, but also an Indian agent, who would negotiate treaties whereby many of the Native Missourians would leave Missouri. First, they would move to the area that is now Kansas, and then decades later, those same Native groups that had previously been in Missouri would eventually move to what is now Oklahoma. And they don't do this because they want to. They do so because they are pressured to do so by the federal government. So as I said, statehood did not cause this change. Rather, statehood itself was a reflection and a product of these changes. I want to close by suggesting what this move from territory to state would mean for the nation as a whole and what it would say about the nation as a whole. Missouri statehood had shown that the United States could indeed expand into the West, that it could remain a representative democracy as it moved across the Mississippi River, that the United States would not have colonies that would remain subordinate in perpetuity, but rather that it would have territories that became states. Territorial rule to statehood, as I said, was the manner through which the majority of states entered the Union. I mentioned how this happened for Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s, but it was still basically the system that was used for Hawaii and Alaska in the 1950s. And what this would mean is that for people living in those states, they would have representation in Congress. They would be able to vote for local and state officials. It was profoundly different from the system that operated in much of the rest of the world. And it was in many ways a system that other countries would be forced to adapt to later as residents on their peripheries demanded fuller political incorporation. As I said, the move from territory to state was often part of a large migration that would occur in much of North America. And this would transform the demography of North America from a place where the population was principally Native American and Native Americans governed to one that was not Native American, that would be multiracial, multi-ethnic, but very much governed by the United States and not by Native Americans. Missouri statehood also announced a profound change in national politics. During this territorial period that I talked about, if you asked a member of Congress, what's the greatest domestic threat to the Union, they would say the tension between East and West. But all of these federal territories joining the Republic had shown that there were ways to mitigate against those tensions. The Missouri crisis had shown that no, in the decades ahead, the greatest internal conflict was going to be a dispute between North and South. And that dispute would be over the future of slavery, whether slavery would expand into the West, whether slavery would be allowed to continue. And that's an issue that in Missouri, of course, isn't settled until the Civil War. It isn't even settled with the Emancipation Proclamation, because this new state of Missouri did not secede in 1861. And the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states in rebellion. It would take the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, for enslavement to end in Missouri. Now, I talk about these national issues because we are commemorating Missouri statehood. But what I want to emphasize is that Missouri does not stand alone. Missouri statehood not only had a huge impact on national politics, but also by looking at the local, we can understand the national. So I want to close on that point. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today, whether you are in person at the History Museum, whether you're joining us remotely by Zoom. I look forward to your questions, but I really hope they can be the basis of a conversation about how to understand our state's history and how to understand this move to statehood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. And we do have a number of questions that came through. First, I do want to apologize to our in-person audience. We're still trying to figure out the best way to both simulcast this on Zoom and in person and get questions from people on both ways. But unfortunately, right now, we're not set up to take questions from our in-person audience. I will put a slide up in a few minutes with my email address on it. Should you have a question for our presenter, please feel free to email me and I can always forward it to Peter and you can have a conversation that way. But we do have a number of questions through Zoom, which will hopefully lead to a good conversation to end our lecture today. So without further ado, Peter, our first question asks, did the Spanish Governor O'Reilly ever actually visit St. Louis?
That's a great question. So Alejandro O'Reilly was the first Spanish governor. Let me restate that. He was the first governor of Spanish Louisiana. He himself was not Spanish, he was Irish. And when he arrived to take charge, he didn't arrive till 1768, and he went to New Orleans because that was the capital of the larger colony of Louisiana. And it was where the largest European and Euro-American population was located. And he arrives there and he tries to reform the colony. And a number of local elites are so upset with how he's doing things, they literally chase him out of town. And he leaves. And he has no reason to come to St. Louis. So to the best of my knowledge, he did not come to St. Louis. But if someone can correct me on that, I hope they will do so. O'Reilly's short tenure is important because it reflects the way that colonial residents have these difficult relationships with imperial centers. It is not just the British colonies that resisted imperial government. The French-speaking population of Spanish Louisiana did not declare independence and had no intention of doing so, but they did want to see colonial reform. I, in fact, can see the question. So I know we've got several of them, and that's really good. So I'm going to be thinking about them, but I hope that answers it. What's the next question, Aaron?
Sure. The next question is, how did the Boot Heel come to be Missouri?
Right. So for those of you not familiar with this, the Boot Heel is the the southeastern corner of Missouri. It's very particular. It's laid out in a very particular way. Now, I talked about the way that Missouri's carved out of this larger territory of Louisiana. And federal leaders, their plan for converting territories into states is that you first take a larger geographic space and then you pare it down. And their first concern is they want them to be roughly similar in size, roughly symmetrical in shape. Some examples of this were that the Indiana territory was divided immediately before Indiana became a state, and they create two roughly equal territories, the territory of Indiana, territory of Illinois. Same thing happens when the Mississippi territory is divided into Mississippi and Alabama. In all of those, if there's a port, they try to have ports in every state. But my understanding of the Boot Heel is it's much simpler, which is that there are people living in these territories who have land investments. And if you lived in the territory of Louisiana, when the territory of Missouri is getting carved out and you own land, you want that to be part of the territory of Missouri, because when that land becomes part of a state, its value is going to go up. So land speculators who held land in the Boot Heel really wanted that to be part of the state of Missouri because it would increase their land values. And also it was part of the land that they held. So it's included really to accommodate them. But another way to think about it is that the land to the south hadn't really been organized into a territory of Arkansas. So there's no competing group that can demand that that land be part of their territory.
Okay. Now, our next question asks, what, if any, provision did the territorial system make for the native peoples?
It's a great question. And territorial government did this in a variety of ways. So when territories were created, there was legislation that created them. And that legislation rarely made reference to Native Americans. But nonetheless, Native Americans were at the center of territorial policy. Every territorial governor had very clear instructions to negotiate with Native Americans, to negotiate treaties that were preferable to the United States, and often in their ongoing correspondence between territorial governors, federal Indian agents, and federal leaders in Washington, D.C., those objectives change over time, and they're almost always driven toward seeing Native Americans cede land so that white settlers want to move to. The other part of this, as I mentioned, is that there were several conditions for a territory to become a state. First and foremost, there had to be evidence that the local white residents had shown their ability to create a Republican system of government, to demonstrate that they knew how to participate in American politics. But in every territory, there was also the expectation that it could be proven that a racial hierarchy had been established and was stable. This did not always require warfare, although it certainly did in places like Ohio and Indiana. What it would mean in Missouri, again, was clear proof that the Osage were not actually governing the area they had governed in central and western Missouri. There is a wonderful collection. I mean, there are a number of terrific books about this. But if you want to read how it played out on the ground, there is a collection of federal documents called Territorial Papers of the United States. They were published over the course of the 20th century. They're divided by federal territory. There are 3 volumes, 3 whole volumes on the place that became Missouri. And if you go there and you look under Indian Affairs, which is the term that was used at that time, you can find hundreds of letters from within the federal government that speak to how this is supposed to operate, not just in terms of negotiations, but in the creation of a legal system that will make clear that Native Americans do not have the same legal rights as Euro-Americans. So in many ways, federal Indian policy takes form in these territories. And it's crucial to understanding not only how it plays out, but where many Native Americans live now. As I said, the descendants of the people who governed what is now Missouri and the descendant governments, I mentioned the Osage, but there are others. Many of them now live in Oklahoma, and this is something that sort of happens through this territorial system, the forced removal of Native peoples into different areas of the West. What's the next question?
So a few more questions here. The next question asks, did the French ever object to our violations of the treaty?
Did the French ever object to our violations of the treaty? Now, what I really like, the very word French is an interesting one, because if you ask American officials, the French might mean the government of France. It also might mean the French-speaking people living west of the Mississippi River. Now, the really interesting thing to me is how the French-speaking people west of the Mississippi River very quickly come to welcome federal rule because they think it's going to mean real benefits for them. And the thing that gets them most upset isn't that they're being pulled into the United States, it's they're not being pulled in quickly enough. If their land titles are preserved, or put another way, if their landed property and human property are preserved, if they're able to participate politically, then they're fine with this because it's a real improvement from colonial rule. Was the government in France concerned about what happened? Not really. Put simply, as long as France got paid, they're fine with what goes on in Louisiana after the treaty, because Louisiana had not been a major concern for France. During the 18th and 19th century, the colonies that really mattered to France were Canada and the profitable colonies in the Caribbean. And when France lost Canada to Britain, when France lost Saint-Domingue to the government, to the insurrectionary government that formed Haiti, the French government doesn't really care about what goes on. It's not like the French government voices large-scale complaints to the US government about the treatment of the French-speaking people in Louisiana. The country that really objects is Spain. The Louisiana Purchase precipitates border conflicts between the US and Spain that went on for years. They're not settled until 1819, and they're only settled on the eve of Mexican independence. So the Spanish complain a lot when they think that the US is intruding on their territory. This is another really good question.
All right, Peter, we've got two last questions for you. This question asks, it says, when you talked about the concerns over slave revolts, Indian uprisings, etc., in the new territory, you said the government was afraid that the people of Missouri wouldn't really understand how governments work, etc. Is that a polite way of saying that they thought we were a bunch of hillbillies?
That's a great question. And actually, the answer is no. Here's what the US leaders thought of the Louisianans in 1803. They knew a little about them in Missouri, a little more about them in Louisiana. And the people they knew about most were the wealthy planters or the wealthy merchants like the Chouteaus. And they thought these are people who are wealthy, they've been living in luxury, and they've been living in a French and especially a Spanish imperial system that has created a stunted political culture. They thought this is part of a larger way in which the Anglo-American leadership of the United States believed that the Spanish Empire was corrupt and that it was unrepresentative and dictatorial. And they thought that that's what these people had learned. And there's a member of Congress who in 1803 on the House floor said, the people of Louisiana will serve an apprenticeship to liberty, that they will leave behind them the corrupt system of Spanish government and they will learn to embrace American government. Here's what they didn't know. The people living in what's now Missouri and Louisiana, they were ready for representative government. And the white residents, they were totally ready to have a plantation system with enslavement. They were ready to vote for office. They were ready for that. The notion that Missouri It's a good question that we were just a bunch of hillbillies. This notion of Missouri as a place of where you have people who are either because of their poverty or this connection aren't politically sophisticated, that stereotype emerges later. And it actually emerges primarily about the Anglo-American settlers who start arriving in the 19th century.
And we'll get you out of here on this last question, Peter. It just asks, can you say a few words about a Missouri Emancipation Proclamation, please?
I actually can't say a few words because to do the subject credit would take a lot of words. It's a great question about how enslavement ends in Missouri. And, Missouri is described as a border state. And because it's geographically on the border between North and South during the Civil War, between the Union and the Confederacy. But when we look at it internally, the Civil War in Missouri was not a civil war. It was an uncivil war. There is no state in the Union where the Civil War proves more divisive because there are white Missourians who are adamantly committed to preserving enslavement. And then there are other white Missourians who are just as strongly opposed to it. And of course, Black Missourians are completely opposed to slavery. And this becomes a bitter civil war in Missouri. And what eventually will happen is that even though the government in Missouri in 1860 was a pro-slavery and in some ways pro-secessionist government, they are displaced by a unionist government. And that's the government that's going to want to see emancipation happen in Missouri. But at the end of the day, it takes, ironically, this unionist government that takes charge means that slavery actually ends later in Missouri than it does in the Confederacy because Missouri is not governed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So I hope that answers that question. And I actually hope I've answered all these questions. I've answered them quickly, which in some ways I don't like because these were great questions and they get at really complicated issues. So it's just been, great to have those questions and to have an opportunity to talk with all of you today.
Yeah, and I want to thanks again to Dr. Peter Castor for joining us this morning. You can see on this slide, we have our regularly scheduled STL History Live programs on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., as well as Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chats on select Wednesdays at noon. And you can find links to all our upcoming programs at mohistory.org, or on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. So please be sure to check out that lineup. And also, please don't forget to fill out that survey and let us know what you thought about our program today. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Have a good rest of your day.
Have a good day.